Delighted to see so many present who are not from the house or from the architecture class. So much also very delighted to welcome you back, Achim. One of the things I enjoy the most about Achim Menges is that he lives in Frankfurt. It means that I, on and off, despite a horribly busy schedule, there's the opportunity to meet and to speak about things, and of course very, very often about architecture. I have met over the last few years few people who with such an intensity and with such a focus goes about his work. You all know that after years in London at the Emergent technologies program and also teaching in the Diploma School, Achim came back to Frankfurt. Sorry, not so much back, although Frankfurt, Achim's wife is from Frankfurt, but they landed here, and Achim took a job in Offenbach. And then from Offenbach, the journey went to Stuttgart, and you all probably know as much as I do that if you allow, at the tender age that he was still then at, and still in many ways a tender age, it's enormously impressive to see what he has built up in Stuttgart, having then established and now leading an institute whose contributions, Achim and his colleagues, the number of doctoral students, and by also a very impressive startup last year of a master program, the collaboration with Jan Knipper's Engineering Institute, but also taking absolutely full using the resources in and around Stuttgart to the fullest, so often collaborating and working with firms and other institutes outside of the collaboration with Jan Knipper's. And in sum, this means basically, and I think it's quite remarkable to when we think about it, I don't think it's that often that something really, really substantial of almost like a changing nature happens in architecture. There was our colleague here in the Staedelschule architecture class, Mirko Becker here, he just completed a little while ago a text that we are putting in the journal that we're publishing soon on what he called eventually the iOS of architecture, namely everything digital and computational. He referred in that text to the paperless studios at Columbia University in the 1990s. I think that was such a moment. I believe DRL probably at the AA in its early days, that was such a moment when, you know, really there's a substantial input and almost like a small sort of game-changing input from academia to architecture. I think, not single-handedly, Achim, I think there are also other people out there who are contributing to it, but it's very clear to me that Achim is one of the leading figures on the scene that is looking precisely into these things that has to do with material culture and design computation. And a last note on that, which is one of the more engaging aspects of the sporadic but ongoing conversation that I'm privileged to have with Achim, is basically to understand that computation goes far, far beyond the purely sort of machinistic, and that the material actually belongs precisely with the second word there, culture. And it's one of the things that I continue to be extremely curious about and attentive to in the work of Achim and his colleagues, precisely because I believe that apart from all the technicalities, the real change, the momentous sort of change, that's only going to happen the moment that second part is fully there fully activated. Achim, we're delighted to have you here, and we look forward to hear your talk.
Thanks, Johan, for the nice introduction. It's always a pleasure to be back here. Before I came, I figured that the last time I gave a lecture here, I think this is the third one, was 2010. So a lot has happened since then. That's why it's a bit of kind of lengthy view of a lot of stuff that we have investigated and researched over the last couple of years. But what I really try to do in this kind of presentation is to give you at the beginning a very kind of brief overview of how we try to situate our work in the kind of larger context of the discipline. And then I will actually delve into explaining 4 areas of research that we conduct at the Institute. And I will do that along a number of projects that we have recently completed. So that's the kind of structure of the talk. But at the beginning, I think it's also important to say something about the name of the Institute, Institute for Computational Design, because it's very important for us to understand that we actually refer to the notion of computation in its kind of most basic manner, which is actually referring to it as the processing of information. And thus one can actually consider both machinic processes that operate in the digital domain of the computer, as well as material processes that operate in the physical realm as computational. And while one can clearly say that there's a strong bias towards what one can actually call machine computation in contemporary design, sporadic investigations of material computation have also occurred in architecture, and I will show some of that later on. But what has really rarely been explored is the kind of largely uncharted territory where machine and material computation overlap, where they don't simply coexist, but where they intensely interact in the design process, which is very much the kind of focal area of our research. So in this way, one can probably say that our work really tries to embrace a particular contemporary condition of architecture. And while one can argue that the separation between the processes of design and making, which really have dominated architectural design thinking since the Renaissance, are still very much intact, one can also already sense that a new understanding of the material in architecture is beginning to arise, where the material can really be rediscovered through the computational. And as design computation no longer remains limited to the kind of binary domain of the digital, it can really be increasingly perceived as an intense interface to the far more complex realm of the physical world. And this enables us, as Sanford Quinter nicely puts it, to use computation to engage aspects of the natural and material world whose logic had previously remained ungraspable, because they were simply lodged at too great a remove from the modalities of the designer's sense and intuition. And this is interesting because it opens up the possibility to no longer conceive of the material as a kind of passive receptor of pre-designed or predetermined form, but really as an active generator of design. And of course, this sort of generative understanding of the material is also not without precedent. So if we want to refer to some of the examples, most sort of eminent examples of 20th century radical German, actually in this case, academia, one could mention Josef Albers' material studies at the Focus at the Bauhaus in Dessau, where he really established a precedent for the possible enrichment of the design processes through what he actually called material experimentation. And it's interesting to note that Albers rejected established processes of materialization that are based on professional craft knowledge because he claimed that they stifle invention. And instead, he identified the material behavior itself as the creative domain for developing new modes of construction and innovation. So his material studies were really conceived not as scalar models or representation of ideas, but as temporary unfoldings of material behavior in space and time, as you can nicely see in this picture. On the other scale of the spectrum, possibly, and another example, is Frei Otto's work that he conducted at his institute at the University of Stuttgart, where through what he called form-finding methods, he investigated vast numbers of different material systems in order to study their capacity to physically compute form. So I like to think of our work as trying to embrace both sort of Alber's experimental approach of employing material as a driving force in an open-ended creative process, and on the other hand, Otto's scientific rigor in conducting design research. But I think it's also important to say that we aim to instigate a critical shift by situating this investigation within a contemporary context of design computation and especially also digital fabrication. And as this is pursued as both a kind of technical and an intellectual venture, the work also seeks to trace the emergence of a novel material culture in architecture. So what I will now introduce are 4 main areas of research focusing on sort of 4 areas related to materiality, materialization, material structure, and material performance, which I will present through a relatively small number of projects, but going through it in relative detail because I think this really exposes the nature of the work. So the first field of research I would like to introduce really investigates how design computation enables the integration of material behavior in the genesis of architecture form, structure, and space. And this was investigated as part of this research project, which was a collaborative project, the first one of my institute and engineers from the Institute of Building Structures and Structural Design of Jan Knippers. And it's also maybe important to mention that all our projects that research the possible integration of sort of the design, computation, and materialization usually begin with an investigation on the kind of microscopic level of the anatomy of the material. And on this level, it's really revealed that in the material that we investigated here, which is wood, in the various layers of the wood cells, the cellulosic microfibrils, which you can see here on the right, really function like fibers that reinforce a matrix of lignin and hemicellulose. And as such, one can really understand wood as a kind of natural composite material which shares a whole number of material properties and characteristics with synthetic composites. One that is particularly prominent is that it combines relatively low stiffness with a high structural capacity. And this is a characteristic that is especially well suited for construction techniques that employ the elasticity of the material to physically compute form. And a good example of that, which is probably also one of the simplest ones you can see here, which is the specific figure, a simple kind of strip of plywood fines once it's exposed to a very simple input, which is the kind of tension on one of the support points. So given this very simple input, the material computes the relatively complex parabolic shape of the elastica curve. That's how it's called. So, however, despite the fact that this elastic material behavior allows for achieving such relatively complex curvature from initially very simple elements, and that can also significantly increase the structural capacity of the systems, it's hardly ever used in architecture. And that's because we as architects simply don't have the ability to draw or model material behavior, and that means that we can usually not design with it. So it's not a surprise that there are only a very few examples of elastically bent architectures, such as the vernacular architectures of the Madan people in southern Iraq that you see here, that actually construct their houses from elastically bent reed bundles, or more probably well known, the timber crit shells that were developed by Frei Otto in the 1970s, that are actually initially assembled as entirely flat and regular wooden lattices, as you can see on the top left. But once they are checked up at strategic points, they find the structurally stable double curved form completely by themselves based on the elastic behavior of the wooden elements. So following a conversation that we had with Frei Otto, this project really aimed to further develop this lineage of bending bending active structures within the context of today's technology, starting with a series of correlated sort of physical and computational tests, and derived from that, we actually established a very basic system that ultimately consists of planar strips that are connected in such a manner that the elastically bent and tensioned regions alternate along their lengths. So basically, just by connecting the strips in irregular distances, they more or less find this specific shape where one element is actually, one segment is in tension, and then it alternates to form this kind of structure. So this is what we call a behavioral system, and for that to turn into a constructional system, it needs to be informed computationally by the means of materialization, which in this case is the use of our industrial robot. I think you don't necessarily need to be a structural engineer to identify that there is a serious weak spot in the system, which is actually the point where the two strips are connected, the joint point. Because here the effective structure depth is reduced to 0. However, we found a way to distribute these local weak spots so that they don't compromise the stability of the overall system. Actually, by letting them oscillate along the structure and thus prevent any sort of local or regional axes of weakness to occur. And that then leads to this kind of distinctive architectural sort of expression. So this distribution of the joint points and its kind of architectural morphological consequences becomes one of the main drivers in the computational design process, so that strategically introducing irregularity here really allows to achieve overall stability. This was then also complemented with actual material simulations of the bending of the initially planar strips that you can see here. And I think one can also really nicely see here how the final shape of the pavilion is really found as the equilibrium state of all interacting elastic elements. So one can say that the behavior of the employed material computes the pavilion shape. So on the other hand, the structurally required irregularity obviously results in a vast number of geometrically different parts, in this case more than 500, but because that is part of a kind of continuous digital sequence, that doesn't pose any problems today. What is possibly more interesting is that in contrast to the substantial sort of intellectual investment in developing the kind of design computation, simulation, and fabrication processes, the final system and assembly is actually surprisingly straightforward and also simple and cheap. So basically these planar strips simply need to be connected, and then more or less completely by themselves they find their specific shape. In other words, even in full scale on site, the material itself computes the pavilion's shape. And this resulting equilibrium state unfolds quite a unique architectural space, while at the same time being extremely efficient with the employed material resources. In fact, the entire structure, which had a diameter of more than 12 meters, could be constructed using birch plywood with a thickness of only 6.5 millimeters, which is about that thick. And this very delicate skin is at the same time the load-bearing structure, which actually needs to fulfill all the kind of requirements of a German building application, which we need to get for all these experimental buildings in terms of wind loads, snow loads, etc. And it's at the same time the light modulating and weather protecting envelope, which in this case touched the ground topography on one side, and on the other side formed the kind of 8-meter free-spanning opening towards the adjacent public square. And on the inside, it's interesting to note that the toroidal space was actually really deep despite the kind of modest dimensions of the building, because it can never be perceived in its entirety, which leads to a surprising spatial depth that was further enhanced by this sequence of direct and indirect illumination that results from the kind of structural undulations of the envelope that themselves result from the kind of material behavior. So in addition to the kind of exploration of these architectural qualities, the construction of these research projects also allows us a kind of more scientific evaluation of our design processes, which we in this case did with the comparison of these 4 models. So on the upper left you see the design computation model, which is based on about 6,500 lines of design code, and the kind of fully fledged material simulation done by the engineers of the ITKE, the fabrication model, and then most importantly a scan of the Pavilion in full scale on site that we did with the help of the Institute for Geodesy and Engineering. So this allows us to actually extract the critical measure points from the kind of full-scale construction and overlay them with the computational design model, and in this case that really only showed very minor deviations. So comparing the results of the generative computation design process, which you can see here on the top, with the scan of the geometry that the material computed in full scale on site, which is this picture here at the bottom, one can really say that this kind of suggested integration of material behavior in design computation is no longer a kind of idealized goal, but quite a feasible proposition. More importantly, in my eyes, I think the project also demonstrates how focusing the computation design process on material behavior rather than geometric shape allows for unfolding performative capacity and material resourcefulness, while at the same time also expanding the design space towards formerly unexplored architectural possibilities. So I think here one can really say that the material no longer remains a kind of passive receptor of a pre-designed shape, but rather becomes an active generator in the design process. The second field of investigation that I would like to present focuses on contemporary processes of materialization. And obviously there's no question that numerically controlled processes have already had a kind of major effect on architectural design. But the kind of pertinent question in our research is how we can make the kind of inherent affordances and constraints of what we call a digital fabrication environment the kind of starting point for architecture inquiry and systematic design research. And for this, we have actually investigated the possible transfer of a concept, mathematical concept, that is of so-called morphospaces from theoretical morphology in biology to computation design and fabrication. Here it's interesting to note that already in the early 1960s, a paleontologist called David Raup published quite a seminal paper in Science in which he presented a series of computer-generated shell forms, which you can see here on the left. That's 1963, around exactly the same year that the first architect/designer ever got his hands on a computer, which was Sutherland at the MIT. So he generated these shell forms, but then the kind of crucial step happened when he actually set up a coordinate system using the 3 parameters that he used to generate the shells as the coordinate axis of that, and by that establishing basically what he called the kind of theoretical morphospace of all geometrically possible forms, which is the white cube. And then he went on and mapped into this space of all possible forms the shell forms that actually occur in nature, and by that he differentiated the theoretical morphospace from the empirical morphospace that includes sort of all material form. And this concept has been extended in today's theoretical morphology towards n-dimensional spaces that are really capable of mathematically describing not yet existent form. So in the next project, which was again a collaborative undertaking of my institute and the Institute of Building Structures and Structural Design and some other members of the competence network biomimetics that we're also part of, we researched this kind of transfer of the concept of morphospaces from theoretical morphology to computation design and fabrication. That project also began with quite a kind of limited scope of investigation at the beginning, which was basically just looking at how new robotic production processes allow us to extend the possibilities of traditional wood jointing techniques. And it turns out that if you employ such a robot for cutting these kind of so-called finger joints, you can actually joint plates in all kinds of different angles and even with different thicknesses together without losing the key advantage of the traditional finger joint, which is that it doesn't require any mechanical fasteners or adhesives. So based on our specific sort of robotic 7-axis setup, we went on to identify the 3 critical morphological parameters of such finger-jointed wood blades, and then we developed a simulation that allowed us to identify the min-max ranges of these parameters, which we then mapped into what we have termed a machinic Morph of Space, and that is basically a theoretical model that allows one to differentiate between the plate morphologies that are geometrically possible and the ones that you can actually fabricate with a specific machine setup. So on the left, you see the kind of theoretical Morph of Space of all geometrically possible plates. In the center, the ones that you can actually machine with a 6-axis robot, and on the right with a 7-axis robot. But this is a representation of the solution space, not of the geometries. Now, what is interesting is that you can computationally walk through that space of possibilities, and then it becomes obviously the question, how do you find the most interesting areas of that space? And in that context, I think the quote by Achim Menges is relevant, who stated that in biology, material is expensive, but shape is cheap, and that is meant metabolically expensive. As of today, the opposite was true in the case of technology. Now, arguably, that is about to change with robotic fabrication, and thus we identified biomimetic design strategies as particularly promising for exploring and uncovering the performative regions of the machinic Morph of Space. For that, you have to understand the behavior, again, the behavior of these plate structures. And obviously, they're very good in withstanding shear forces at the edges, you can imagine that, but they're very weak in transferring bending moments on the edges, and they can't hardly withstand tension forces. And that actually proves to be a serious challenge if you want to construct a larger blade structure. However, there are natural systems that have addressed exactly that challenge. For example, the sand dollar, which is a kind of specific sea urgent that actually has a plate skeleton that consists of discrete polygonal plates that are connected by the kind of biological equivalent to finger joints, which are these kind of stereotype projections on the kind of individual plate edges. So that obviously means that the sand dollar has found plate morphologies that fully capitalize on the finger joint structural capacity by evolving shell forms that transfer all the forces that are acting on them into shear forces along the blade edges, because that's the only thing he can really carry. So together with the biologists from the University of Tübingen, we identified the 8 relevant biomimetic design principles that govern this performative capacity and captured them in algorithmic rules that were embedded in kind of computational design process that enables the designer to explore the machinic morphospace of the physically producible through the filter of the biomimetic rules, which then in concert with spatial and contextual criteria leads to a highly specific blade morphology that you can see here. So the resultant sort of quite distinctive morphological differentiation leads to a high structural performance, but in return requires the fabrication of more than 850 different blades, with in this case more than 100,000 finger joints. But as the logics of materialization were a kind of driver in the design process from the beginning, and the generation of the fabrication data and actually down to the kind of robot control code is embedded in the design tools already, so that we could actually directly embark on manufacturing this demonstrator or prototype Pavilion which you can see here. So this is the kind of 7-axis setup. You can imagine it's not trivial to control a robot like that. For anything beyond 6 axes, there's actually no off-the-shelf software. So you have to program more or less everything yourself. The blade is pre-cut by the robot, and then you can see how it starts to cut the finger joints in one go. This is possible because of a tool that we had specially developed by one of our industrial partners that can cut at the tip and the flange. And thus the kind of also the precision of the finger joints in the wood is actually the precision of the tool, which is obviously the sub-tenths of a millimeter range. Again, despite the pretty involving design, simulation, and fabrication process, you end up with a very simple system, which is basically a big puzzle for boys and girls. And they can be assembled without the need for any additional equipment or tools. And the most interesting thing is that these are self-correcting shapes. So once you manage to assemble one module, you know that it's actually absolutely precise, which allowed us to assemble the shell in a very unorthodox manner, which is from the bottom up, which means that if you reach the top, your last part doesn't fit, you go back to 0. That's the way you would never actually really build a shell in construction. However, and that was again verified by a comprehensive laser scan of the entire system, everything fitted well together, as you can also see in this picture. And the resulting lightweight modular wood shell really demonstrates, again, both the structure capacity and also the architectural potential of a system that exclusively consists of these, again, very thin birch plywood plates that are only connected by these robotically fabricated finger joints. And as the structural performance here really results from each element's specific morphological response, the entire pavilion with a diameter of more than 12 meters could be built using only extremely thin plates. So here all the plates are again 6.5 millimeters. There's not a single plate that is thicker, which means that we could enclose 200 cubic meters of space with only 2 cubic meters of wood, which equals a ratio of less than 1 to 100. More importantly, I think the project again demonstrates how one can achieve a kind of novel architectural performativity without necessarily compromising the structural or material performance. So in this case, it was possible to overcome the kind of quite hermetic character of usual cell structures by inserting this kind of oculus towards the park, and also having this kind of doubled layer situation, which was further enhanced by an indirect illumination, and then the kind of splitting up of the shell where you literally walk into the in-between space where the structural logic of the system is revealed. So more recently, we had the chance to go from this kind of project which happens at the overlap between research and education towards a more comprehensive research project, which also included the construction of a demonstrator building. This was actually opened a couple of weeks ago. And this project enabled us to actually further investigate a number of aspects. First, we were able to bridge the gap between academic research and the construction industry, as within our research partnership, we managed to equip an actual timber manufacturer with this robotic technology, so that this building was actually produced in the professional context of timber manufacturing. And you can see how modest the size of such a robotic unit is compared to all the other kind of timber manufacturing equipment that you usually need. Second, we were also able to reduce the structure to a single layer of beech plywood panels, which is actually a material with outstanding structural performance, which in this case is also locally grown and processed. However, despite the fact that beech has actually, or is significantly stronger and stiffer than all the kind of common softwood products, it is usually deemed unsuitable for architecture and mainly used as firewood because of its dimensional instability and its tendency to warp after manufacturing. And this can actually be overcome through the robotically fabricated finger joints, which opens up an entirely new use for this natural high-performance material. So the beech plywood panels are initially pre-formatted very quickly on such a speed panel cutter, which is obviously also computer numerically controlled. And then the characteristic finger joints are cut by this 7-axis robot, which then also subsequently drills all the pilot holes for the required screws. So the resulting structure is a kind of highly precise 50 millimeter thick segmented shell, and in this load-bearing skin, the robotically fabricated finger joints still remain the kind of crucial morphological feature for the structural performance, as they transfer, as you can nicely see here, the decisive in-plane shear forces, which are about 3 times higher than all the other forces that occur. So for that project, we developed a computational design process where the plates are not modeled or parametrically applied to an already existing surface, but instead the plates are defined as agents with a particular behavior that seeks a configuration that ensures fabricability. So on the one hand, that includes the geometric challenge of covering a double curved surface that actually features a transition from a kind of dome-like positive Gaussian curvature zone to a kind of negative Gaussian curvature saddle-shaped geometry with planar elements, which in itself is not a trivial undertaking. So we had to sort of mathematically define the plate agent behavior to accommodate the related change in plate morphology from convex to concave polygon. And then the second aspect that is incorporated in that computational design process is the actual joint morphology and its coherence with the building codes for the robotically fabricated finger joints. There's a decisive factor, which is the kind of material that is left on both sides of the screws, which means that if you don't cohere with that, you will actually not get it through proof engineering. So that results in a computational design process in which the plates explore the machinic morph of space of the robot as individual agents whose behaviors are driven by the constraints of planarity, producibility, fabricability, and actually assembly. So the overall morphology of these kind of 243 plates is derived through that kind of process, shows a nice gradient change from the sort of synclastic to anticlastic shell regions, which results in this kind of change from convex to concave polygons, which then also becomes the kind of prominent feature on the inside where the load-bearing shell remains as the visible surface. On the outside, the shell is equipped with a kind of 5-axis digitally prefabricated wood fiber insulation and kind of tailor-made, also digitally fabricated weather-proofing membrane, as well as a timber cladding. So here you can see the assembly on site, which was surprisingly fast. The whole thing was actually erected in less than 8 days on this kind of temporary scaffold that you can see here. And that was done without the need for any additional tools for the assembly of these kind of robotically prefabricated plates. So now it's a kind of puzzle for man, I guess. So on top of this kind of super thin load-bearing plate shell, and you get the kind of idea of the thinness in this picture, the aforementioned insulation and waterproofing was added, and finally the kind of timber cladding is applied on the outside. However, on the inside, and the kind of really interesting space obviously on the inside, the load-bearing shell remains as the visible spatial surface where the structural logic of the system becomes tangible through the subtle yet distinctive articulation of the plate morphology. So the hermetic shell form is penetrated with kind of larger glass facades on both ends, and on their edge, both the thinness of the shell as well as the logics of the plate distribution can be experienced. And on the inside, as mentioned before, the load-bearing shell is exposed as quite a unique structural surface that actually unfolds two distinct spatial situations with a kind of spatial contraction formed by the anticlastic plate surfaces with their concave polygons that then opens up towards a larger space created by the synclastic plate surfaces with convex polygons that frames the view towards the kind of open landscape. So basically visitors migrate from the one spatial condition emphasizing the hermetic character of the shell towards the vistas across the gardens and the landscape. And I think again, overall, that project shows how material and fabrication-informed design computation can lead to quite a novel convergence of spatial quality, material expression, and also resource efficiency. Here, the entire load-bearing eggshell, which encloses more than 600 cubic meters of space, was actually built using less than 12 cubic meters of wood. And this remarkable performance capacity is revealed as a kind of ratio between the shell span and the shell thickness, which shows that proportional to the overall size, this timber plate shell has actually half the thickness of an eggshell. Gives you a kind of understanding how thin it is. So in many ways, the project begins to indicate how sort of resource performance and architectural performativity can be synthesized in a way that goes beyond the tried sort of modernist truths to materials and related fixed and singular structural and spatial typologies towards new modes of spatial experimentation based on an open-ended material and structure system that unfolds from a novel computation convergence of the processes of materialization and form generation. And what is quite fascinating for us is to see that this is quite a feasible and tangible innovation. And just recently, we, in a kind of team with Alman Sattler-Wapner architects, became second in a competition which involved more than 170 teams for a large 10,000 square meter advanced manufacturing facility, which showed that the system could actually easily span almost 30 meters and a length of 120 meters. On a different note, it's also interesting that this kind of system still follows relatively common logics of building construction, which is based on the idea of assembling a larger structure from a set of discrete elements. In contrast to this, most biological systems follow quite a different logic, where materiality is really constructed as a composite material structure of continuous, usually fibrous elements that are organized across multiple scales of hierarchy. And this is the focus of the third area of research that I would quickly like to introduce. So in fact, almost all load-bearing structures in biology are actually fibrous composites, but biology makes only use of remarkably few materials. And given the sheer diversity of biological systems, it may come quite as a surprise that there are only 4 different materials in nature, and that is cellulose in plants, collagen in animals, chitin in insects, and skills in spider webs. And as George Jeremides quite nicely puts it, these basic materials are actually not successful so much because of what they are, because they have actually not so remarkable mechanical properties, but because of the way they are put together. So the astounding functional integration and performative capacity that we observe in natural systems is really down to the morphological differentiation of the fibrous structures in response to the kind of forces and environments that are acting on them. So in the next project, which was again a kind of collaborative undertaking of architects, engineers, and biologists from the various institutes, we investigated this idea of building up a kind of continuous shell in which the material structure itself becomes differentiated according to the various requirements. And a nice example of such a structure is the exoskeleton of the American lobster, here already in its cooked state, as you can tell by the red color. And if you ever had such a kind of lobster meal, you may have experienced that different parts of the exoskeleton actually have quite different material properties. The pincher and crusher claw is very stiff and strong. The tail segments are quite flexible and elastic. And this is verified by this engineering diagram of your lobster dinner experience. But it's interesting to note that despite the fact that there are all these kind of different material characteristics, the entire exoskeleton is made from one material only, which is a kind of natural composite of chitin fibers that are embedded in a protein matrix, and the kind of material differentiation really happens through the differentiation of the fibrous system across multiple scales of hierarchy. So together with the biologists from the University of Tübingen, we investigated a couple of different parts of the lobster shell under the microscope to identify different fibrous organizations, and then we went on to investigate new processes for actually fabricating with synthetic composite materials, because they share a whole number of logics with these natural fibrous systems. So what you can see here is, for example, the not so new 3DL technology of North Sails, which actually lays every fiber individually according to the stress patterns on a kind of high-end racing sails in this case. So these kind of fiber placement technologies are only kind of limited use for architecture, because they always require an extremely elaborate mold. And because of that, we thought of a kind of alternative process of robotic filament winding, where the mold is actually reduced to a very kind of simple linear framework onto which an initial layer of glass fiber is applied, that then becomes kind of the lost form or the lost mold onto which the actual structural carbon fibers are applied. So once you've understood the kind of possibilities of manufacturing something like this with the robot, you need to conduct a whole number of tests to understand the material properties that you can yield from this process. And based on these tests and further simulations of a kind of robotic, the development of a robotic manufacturing process, we then went on to design, again, a kind of pavilion structure that follows the biological principles of different fibrous organizations, in which there are regions of unidirectional carbon fiber arrangements at the support points where you have a lot of stresses, and similar to the kind of biological systems, you have more so-called helicoidal fiber arrangements where the surfaces mainly function as a kind of division between the inside and the outside. So these principles were embedded in a computational method for developing a related design technique that unfolds quite a rich repertoire of possible architectural morphologies. One thing that is particularly important here is the kind of pre-stress with which the fibers are applied, because you can imagine that the form changes during the entire construction process. So because of that, the whole manufacturing sequence was actually simulated. So this is the manufacturing setup that we developed for that project, which is based on a large 7-axis robot, or 6-axis robot, which is connected to this robotically controlled turntable with a kind of temporary scaffold that revolves around, and then the kind of robot lays the fibers on that. So obviously you can see that this radically differs from most other construction processes. Instead of a kind of assembly of parts, here the entire structure is wound from one continuous fiber. And in this process, the shell is built up initially of successive layers of glass fiber, which provide the kind of space-making surfaces, and at the same time become the kind of lost mold for the subsequent layers of the actually structural carbon fiber. And as you can also see nicely right here, the fibers are actually applied wet, which means they run through the resin bath before, and then they are applied in a kind of resin-saturated way, and then slowly dry out in the build-up process, so that at the end you have one continuous structure, which in this case consists out of more than 60 miles of robotically laid carbon and glass fiber, but is only approximately 4 millimeters thin at its thickest part actually, and extremely lightweight, which enables an amazing level of transparency and intricacy of the resulting surfaces, particularly when perceived from the inside. So synthesizing the capabilities of the machine with building up the material structure itself, and the transparent glass fiber surfaces and the black carbon fiber roughings really allow to perceive the logic of the differentiated fibrous organization within the translucent envelope, all basically forming one continuously constructed materiality, which, similar to the natural systems, is characterized by a kind of topological exactitude of fibrous organization rather than a kind of absolute geometric precision. So here, the construction logics establish both a kind of super thin, yet highly performative thin structure, and this is probably more interesting, they open up a new repertoire for architectural fibrous tectonics, which in many ways allows overcoming the kind of exuberance that is so emblematic for so many other contemporary composite designs. So one interesting challenge that we faced with this project was transportability, which is somewhat constrained with a kind of large continuous shell. In this case, this had more than almost 10 meters diameter. So the only way to transport that is actually to use a helicopter really, or a couple of students, which limits the scope of transportability, I guess. So in the next project, we had a kind of more stringent requirements for transportability, which meant that we wanted to investigate a similar process of robotic coreless filament winding, but kind of to produce a modular system. This is based, again, on a kind of biological example, which in this case is the elytron of beetles. And the elytron is this kind of hardened forewing of the beetle, which protects the actual flying wing, which is obviously a super delicate structure. So in flying beetles, as opposed to ground beetles, which you can see on the top left here, this elytron is a very lightweight, delicate, double-layered structure, which we investigated for 6 different kinds of beetles. And for that, we collaborated with the Institute for Synchrotron Radiation at the KIT in Karlsruhe, where we were able to use their electron accelerator, which is this neat machine which has an orbit ring of an amazing 35 meters in which they accelerate the particles and then they shoot them at our little beetle. And by that, you can actually create a kind of microtomography of our tiny elytra, of which you see the results here. So this is the resulting 3D model that includes all the kind of anatomical data of the thin double-layered morphology, which we did for 6 different flying beetles, which allowed us then to kind of comparatively analyze the morphological features of this kind of thin shell. So this is a video of the overall morphology of one elytron that indicates that it works structurally both as a shell that has a cantilever on the left side and in other regions as a kind of shell that actually spans between 2 support points, which is probably better visible in this image. And then we zoomed in order to understand how this double-layered skin is actually produced onto the dot, where one can see that very different from the way that you would construct a kind of double-layered shell in construction. Here, the fibers are actually continuous between the top and the bottom layer of the wing. So, together with a number of other biomimetic design principles that we sort of identified with the biologists, this became the starting point for the development of a kind of modular element, which again is based on glass and carbon fiber filament winding, in this case with a kind of dual robotic setup. So in many ways, the process is similar to the last project, but this time we really start to build up the module into the void between 2 robots. And again, first into this void, a kind of layer of glass fiber is wound, and then on top of that glass fiber, the actual structural carbon fiber is applied, which is differentiated according to a simulation of the force flow in every component. So that despite the kind of modularity of the system, you get this kind of continuity of fibrous force flow that you can see here on the right side. So this is the manufacturing process. This time the fiber emitter is static. Again, it's kind of a wet winding process, and then the kind of robots pick up the fiber. In this case, it's just beginning to wind the kind of structural carbon fiber application. You can also see that this process is much more robust when it comes to the pre-tension. So the fibers actually find by themselves the right position, as you can see in a second, when they kind of slide into, now this kind of slides into the right spot, more or less by itself. So fabricating one of these modules takes about a day or two, and you end up with a very lightweight elements. In fact, the largest component has a diameter of about 2.6 meters and weighs only 24 kilograms. That again means that you can assemble it in a relatively straightforward manner on site, and this is the kind of resulting system which actually fitted together pretty nicely, and again obviously reveals a space that is pretty distinct or unique, both in its kind of tectonic articulation as well as in its kind of material surface articulation. What is also interesting is that you can really perceive the kind of delicate edge of the double-layered structure on the outside, and the entire system actually changes quite dramatically in its appearance from daytime to nighttime, becoming actually increasingly opaque with the application, once the glass fibers pick up the light, the artificial light. So I think again, this structure shows how really focusing the design, or not limiting the design process just on the kind of exploration of form, structure, and space, but really focusing also on the processes of fabrication from which form, structure, and space unfolds, truly enriches the scope of possibilities for architectural design. So I come to the last chapter, which I will go through very quickly because I understand I'm talking for 1 hour now, but this is an exciting part, so I will not leave that out, which is basically an investigation on how we can use those tools of digital fabrication and computation design to explore new sort of performative capacities, even in materials that have been around for a long time. So this part will focus on a number of projects that we have done investigating the kind of climate responsive abilities of arguably one of the oldest construction materials that we have, which is wood. And as you all know, wood is actually a hygroscopic material which maintains its moisture content in equilibrium with the surrounding relative humidity. And this absorption and desorption of water molecules results in a differential change of dimension. And usually we experience this so-called dimensional instability of wood as a deficiency of the material. And in fact, we invest more than 70% of the energy in wood processing in order to suppress this inherent material behavior through kiln drying that you can see here, which is meant to sort of lower the moisture content to a level where a certain kind of range of dimensional stability can be given or guaranteed. So in this project, we were interested in doing somewhat the opposite by developing a kind of climate responsive skin in which the responsiveness is literally ingrained in the material structure itself. And probably you all know a nice natural example that does exactly that, which is a spruce cone, which grows in a moist, closed state on the tree. Then it falls off the tree, and once the kind of surrounding microclimate reaches suitably dry condition, the cone completely by itself opens up and the seeds are released. And what is interesting is that at that time the cone is already a dead plant organ, so no sort of metabolic energy is invested into that process. And that is possible because the cone has found a way to translate the dimensional change within the kind of cellulose lignin composite into a shape change of the scales, which we transferred in the development of a very simple sort of humidity-sensitive veneer composite element, which has the same possibilities, as you can nicely see in this video, of adapting to different relative humidity, as you can see on the hygrometer reading on the left. Sort of it translates that into different shapes. So this idea of a kind of humidity-driven shape change can be programmed into the material. So after researching that for a couple of years, we've now found ways of doing what you can see here. Both sample pieces have exactly the same material, are the same material structure, yet they behave in exactly the opposite manner. One opening with an increase of humidity and the other one closing. We've also sort of investigated that in a whole number of full-scale mock-ups, done a lot of laboratory tests, and also have conducted for 2.5 years, almost 3 years now, a long-term test on the roof of our university building, where we basically monitor the environmental conditions and the response of the system every 15 minutes. And thus far, this has shown that the system performs absolutely faultlessly. Every time rain approaches and the humidity level rises, the system closes entirely by itself, without the need for any additional sort of electronic or mechanical equipment, and it has done so for many thousands of cycles without any fatigue or decay. At the same time, we have developed computational design processes that allow us to integrate the material anatomy, characteristics, and behavior in computational design processes, which we were able to test in 2012 because we had the chance to explore this system based on a commission by the Centre Pompidou in Paris to actually contribute an installation to their permanent collection. So in many ways, the Pompidou obviously embodies the architectural opposite to our approach. In fact, one can probably say that the entire building celebrates the very technology that maintains a stable interior climate as one of its key architectural features on the outside. So our concept for that installation was to insert into the space of the Pompidou on the first floor where this installation is actually located, as you can see there, a virtual extension of the exterior climate in the form of a large display case in which we actually reproduce the dynamics of the external environment within the interior of the Pompidou, which is arguably one of the most stable climates in the world. So situated within this glass case, the specific system morphology is actually computationally derived based on the one hand, the kind of system intrinsic material variables and the material anatomy, and on the other, the heterogeneous distribution of the humidity that occurs even within such a kind of regulated environment as the glass box, as is nicely shown by the simulation that was done by our project partners, Transsolar. So in addition to the design research, we also fabricated that entire monster in-house, which was really a kind of elaborate job because you have to monitor all the composite panels during production, fabrication, and then even transport, but ultimately everything arrived in one piece. And as you can nicely see here, the structure was erected in that sort of glass case in which the climate corresponds to the outside relative humidity changes in Paris. And the kind of morphology responds to these kind of climatic changes and thus kind of provides a visual experience of the subtle humidity fluctuations that form part of our everyday life but usually completely escape our spatial perception. So a mere increase in relative humidity really triggers the system to open, and although there are really only very simple veneer composite elements the system embodies the capacity to sense, actuate, and respond with no need for any additional mechanical or electronic equipment or even the supply of external energy. So I think one can really say that here the material itself is the machine. So more recently, we also had the chance to investigate that system on a kind of small-scale architecture based on a commission that we received for a pavilion for the permanent collection of the Frag Center in Orléans, which has a similar skin, but this skin operates in exactly the opposite manner, which means the apertures, these kind of distinctive apertures, are closed at high relative humidity levels and then automatically open once the relative humidity decreases. So that means that on a sunny day, the structure or the apertures are fully open, and once a kind of thunderstorm or rain approaches, the relative humidity always goes up. That's a kind of physical or natural law, and the entire structure sort of closes. And this kind of deep ecological embedding allows for quite a unique convergence of environmental and spatial experiences based on this kind of silent and subtle movement of the translucent linear elements. It's too long.
Is the triangular form of the reactive sheets trigger the reactiveness? Or would it be less with the stripe then?
Interesting enough, there is a kind of relation to the geometry of the pieces, but it works almost equally well with something that looks more like a rectangular plate, which is pretty surprising. But the response time is different with the different geometries. So one of the most tricky parts is because in the Pompidou there are 8,000 different parts. You need to choreograph their movement in a way that they sort of close and open without entangling or kind of getting stuck. So that was really one of the key challenges from the computational design point.
I'm wondering, like, because your research is so structured and so specific and like how did you find this research structure and like when did this like happen to form in such a structured way, like the research, like how did you find it?
It appears structured and well sort of coordinated in the presentation, because if not, the presentation would be probably 5 hours. But I think one thing that is really important to say, I think there are two levels on which, sort of two levels to your question. One is, I assume, to be answered in a way that these are processes that have a lot of problems, failures, and I think that's also part of, that's what makes it interesting and exciting. Obviously, in a presentation like that, it's more presented like a coherent story, and also to make it understandable. I think the second part of your question is, why do you do something like this to start off with, or how did you find that one can actually be interested in something like this? And this is actually a sort of a longer term project, I would say an overall project that I started or had the kind of privilege to be involved with my colleagues at DA immediately after graduation. And in those days, that was the kind of era of blobby texture, where the digital had everything was predominantly digital, which led to some sort of unsatisfactory moments when it came to materialization. So I never really fully understood why you would want to use the computer as a kind of drawing or modeling machine, rather than using it as a kind of calculator of complex relationships. So because I think that's what it's much better at. So in that sense, it is interesting that the computer is not a division line between the virtual and the real, but it's actually a connection between the material and the computational. And I think once you've kind of understood that, or once you sort of see that as a possibility, and you see that as a possibility that enriches your scope of possibilities as a designer, it's a kind of incredible field to venture into and to explore. So I think also we are only at the kind of beginning of that. And there's a lot of scope for further explorations. But I think that's what sort of makes me, how do you say that, stand up in the morning, go to work.
That's interesting because you mentioned that conversation that exactly that time at the basically the foundations laid for all that research. And I don't know if you kind of anticipated back then that you opened that up. And if so, what's your take now? What's ahead? You're still running on that kind of setup, or I seem to understand that you're kind of almost kind of generating new kind of layer from which to develop.
Well, I think the kind of conceptual foundations were very much laid in those days at the AA. And I think in those days at the AA, it didn't feel like, I mean, that's part of the answer, it didn't feel like you laid the conceptual foundations for something that keeps you busy for the next 15 years. Instead, actually, we thought we actually relayed back to a lot of things that had happened before, you know, because there's also a legacy to that line of work. I think one could actually nicely trace an entire history of this kind of work that was completely overshadowed by the modernist way of dealing with the kind of what is called the truth to materials and so on and so on. So I think that's one part, but obviously once you venture into something, into a kind of investigation like that intensely, you also discover that in this kind of initial conceptual setup there were some incoherencies from which you can actually develop new possibilities. So I think, I would argue, we are not working still with the same sort of primary hypothesis that we sort of started with in 2002 at the AA, but we are still working in a kind of similar domain. But I think we are sort of now, and that's the interesting thing, is that once you come to the point that you are able to really materialize some of these things, you can really go and sort of reformulate also the underlying hypotheses that drive that research.
The question on the last project. How strong was the dependence of between the sizing of these sheets of wood and the amplitude of bending? I mean, simply speaking, what was the maximum size of the piece of wood that would be bended well?
The maximum size of the piece of wood is determined by the maximum size of the tree that you can find, which is naturally limited. I mean, generally, I sort of know what you're hinting at, but I can tell you this is one of the few moments where it's not all about size. So I think what is really interesting is that these things work extremely well in a kind of cumulative fashion if you have loads and loads of small elements. So I think even in a large-scale application, you should not necessarily think about making the responsive pieces necessarily bigger, but rather how you actually come up with a kind of entire field of those and how you actually may integrate the kind of responsive parts into a more sort of stable substructures and things like this. These are more the questions that we are concerned with. First question by architects is always how big can the panel be? But I don't think that that's necessarily the answer, because all the kind of trouble we have with convertible roofs, and I think this is more something that is geared towards convertible roofs of semi-outdoor spaces rather than facades, because it's completely passive. The real problem starts if you have large moving elements. No? So I think this is a nice alternative. That's how nature deals with these things. I mean, in botany, you never find large pieces that move. You always find a huge number of small pieces that actually respond and move.
So do you think you're going to continue exploring the possibilities of geometrical structures in wood? You moved over some of this Pavilion to the very fiber, but we have many of these as mainly wood.
Yeah. These are two parallel lines of research, yes. I think, and for us it's actually not so different, because in the end wood is just a kind of natural fiber composite made from cellulose microfibrils and lignin as the kind of matrix. So we don't necessarily see so much of a difference. And interesting enough, a lot of the fibrous composite engineers that we work with are also very fascinated by wood. So it's only our categorization into construction materials that make that seem quite distinct fields of investigation. But we don't necessarily see it as that. In fact, the last project is a nice example, because here you have the two coming together. No? It's kind of the natural wood, which does the intelligent stuff, and then you have to, in this case, more or less dump composite that encapsulates it, but enables to unfold the kind of responsiveness of the wooden pieces.
But I actually thought that you can grow it in your garden and sort of deliver a way for using materials. So
exactly, yeah.
you can explore the limits there.
No, I mean, wood, that's something that one really needs to say. As of yet, we don't have any other construction material, and certainly not carbon and glass fiber, that can sort of match wood's environmental virtues. No? It's the only material that we have that's naturally renewable, has actually a positive carbon footprint, embedded energy is extremely good. So, and I think for that, it's interesting to see how much, let's say, scope for exploration is still in this material, which is arguably one of the oldest materials we have, through these kind of new computational processes.
The last part that you told is completely on humidity. I hope I structured it properly. So the thing is, if the humidity is varies, like probably coastal region, the humidity is more. So is it like the structure is open, completely open, or that one part? And second thing is, there optimum level, like the temperature also affects probably like a range to how much extent it could work. Extreme conditions, I think, I don't know how much successful it would be in extreme conditions. So that range also, and even if it's too high always in these kind of regions,
I don't know whether you remember that video where we had the tools model, two tests working at the same time. This was an indication how you can actually program the material in the fabrication process to respond to very different ranges of humidity. Humidity is always a function of temperature, but this is something that can be actually fully accommodated in the kind of the design and the fabrication of the system, to the extent that you can make them behave in exactly the opposite manner. So it's on that level, there's not a kind of limit to that, and it's a very robust system. No, if it exceeds a certain level of relative humidity to which it's programmed, it just sort of keeps on rolling up, or actually pressing to the kind of frame.
So there are variations in different types of wood, or the wetting change. Have you found any variations?
Every wood has a different sort of swelling shrinking ratio. The wood that we use is maple, which actually does not move as much as beech, but has a kind of natural acid content, which means it's not affected by fungi even over long term. You can use various different woods. You can actually, what we do is we scan the pieces before we apply them, because the anatomy of every tree is different, so you get slightly different responses. It's kind of, you really begin to, what should I say, almost indulge into the natural variability of the material, and you can actually make it work for you.
So the use of wonderful high-rise structures has now sort of started to become a new, interesting way of seeing high-rise buildings. So your techniques here, do you think they can be commercialized in new ways of finding structure for high-rise buildings?
When you want to do timber structure, high-rise timber structures, you don't have to speak to a timber engineer or an architect. You have to speak to the kind of guys that make the building regulations, because everything is limited by fire regulations, no? And building codes. That's not it's not the issue. But what is interesting, which you may actually know of, is that there's a guy just a couple of, maybe 100 kilometers east from here, who has started to build a huge manufacturing plant for beech plywood. And the proposed use for the majority of that, the company is called Pollmeyer, it's near Aschaffenburg. What they plan to use the beech plywood for is actually wind turbines. Because the wind turbines don't have such stringent fire regulations as residential or office buildings. And they have one huge problem, which is that the wind turbines need to, the kind of mast of the wind turbine, which is like more than 100 meters tall, needs to be one piece. And once you actually start welding them together on site, which you need because they're huge, you get all kinds of distortions, which really limit the scope of possibilities when it comes to the height of the wind turbine mast. Now, if you can do that you can do all this with beech plywood, you actually overcome this limit that the current steel structures have. So this guy has invested 120 million euros into building up a plant to produce exactly this kind of beech plywood material, which actually wasn't produced before, not for sort of structural purposes. And I think, again, it's kind of interesting to see how such old materials like beech almost are kind of finding an entirely new purpose in this case, sort of structures, ultimately also in architecture, and that has mainly to do with that now there are the simulation technologies to handle the kind of warping and sort of irregular effects that obviously timber has as a natural material, as opposed to materials that are specifically designed for the construction industry. When we actually started that project, this timber shell with the beech plywood panels, we had to tour around for 2 years to find a timber manufacturer that would actually participate in the research project, because they all said it's absolutely impossible. All these things will warp and you will not be able to assemble it. And that is engineered to a tolerance of less than 1 millimeter. So I think it's interesting to see that, and I repeat myself, there's still scope to discover with these kind of pretty standard and also fully kind of approved and certified construction materials.
Biologists or engineers or architects, could you perhaps elaborate in terms of transmitting information or providing information back and forth about in terms of communication and the project scope dealing with information?
I mean, what is really important, and I may have not stretched that enough during the presentation, is that these are all interdisciplinary projects in which structural engineers, biologists, occasionally computer scientists, material scientists are actually involved. And we are not sort of trying to pretend that we do all this. So I think what is really important to understand for architects is that if you really want to do interdisciplinary work, you have to have some disciplinary competence, but also discipline to stick to what your contribution is. And I think that is the first important recognition. And then to answer the more pragmatic aspect, what we find extremely liberating is that there is a real issue in communicating with other disciplines on the base of language. You talk about program with an architect, an engineer, and a material scientist, or tissue. All terms which you think you are completely aware of what it means, and the other guys also think that they are completely know what they're talking about, yet they have radically different sort of meanings. And these are just the simple examples, no? And I think what we have found extremely liberating is the work through programming and computation, because that's where a lot of disciplines share a common set of terms, procedures, and processes. And that has become actually extremely helpful. I would even argue that this is the bridge. I mean, for us, programming is as much a tool as it is a communication platform with other disciplines.
So curious that a lot of your projects you use hexagonal mesh to be your structure of your form. Why you use a hexagonal mesh?
Sorry?
Hexagonal.
I think let's say hexagons we actually rarely use, but a lot of these things are polygons, no? That change the number of, sort of with a changing number of sides. That's simply because if you look at natural systems, you will find also that this is one of the few primary kind of structural formations that you find. And once you actually embed similar principles in your design process, is not a kind of miracle that you end up with something that has a certain sort of, I would say, topological resemblance to these natural structures.
Very good. Achim, thank you so much.